You're listening to The Big Album Show with Paul Dillon and Dan O'Neill. Hello and welcome to this episode of The Big Album Show. I'm Dan.
And I'm Paul.
On this show, we're discussing So Much for the City by Dublin band The Thrills. Released in 2003, it was the year the Spire of Light was erected in Dublin's O'Connell Street. Thousands marched all over the world against the war in Iraq and here in Ireland also. Ireland hosted the International Special Olympics. The OC was what we were watching on TV, and we all wondered if Witness would be as good now it had moved from Fairyhouse to Punchestown. Paul, does this album bring back memories for you?
It does, Dan, and it's hard to believe it's 18 years ago. And I suppose that's a little bit of the aging process. Of course, the Thrills were not a band who managed to grow old, or maybe they are forever young. They managed 3 albums between 2003 and 2007. So Much for the City, which we're discussing tonight. They followed that up with Let's Bottle Bohemia, and then they finished that off with Teenager in 2007. And it brings back incredible memories for me. I mean, it is very difficult to describe 18 years on just how big the Thrills were in 2003. I mean, this album was the sound of the summer. And you have to say, Dan, it sounds like summer. And I haven't listened to it for 18 years, frankly. But when I went back to it, all the memories came, flooding back. And just a lovely, positive, upbeat sound. The singles, of course, are great. We'll get to them. We'll discuss them. And just worth remembering how big they were in 2003. I mean, this was it got to top the charts in Ireland, of course, went to number 3 in the UK. They played a huge gig in Glastonbury, 2003 in Glastonbury. You had a feeling this was a band that was coming up, and they did a big gig in Witness, which I was at, and that was again just really, really good. And they had a moment, they had a real moment back in 2003. They never quite repeated it. They never quite managed to hold on to what they had. But it's a great album. And one of the funny things about this album, Dan, is it is a real tribute to American music, to North American music. And I feel you can aspire to this kind of sound. They have this, the pictures of the band, the way they looked. It's all a bit like, USA biscuits, the USA biscuits you have in Ireland. And why are they called USA biscuits? Because people are aspiring to some kind of North American lifestyle, and that's what this album is for me. The story of the Thrills, and we'll trace it back in a few moments. But the story of the Thrills really began a few years earlier. Originally, they were a band called Freelance. Then they changed their name to Cheating Housewives. And I love, one of the things I love about this band is they have a deep relationship with the geography of Dublin. So from Blackrock, went to primary school in Foxrock, secondary school in Ranelagh, and their first gig as Freelance was in Slattery's pub on Capel Street. And, let's put a big shout out tonight, Slattery's pub in Capel Street. Let's get a plaque up there to remember that. The Thrills, as a young band called Freelance, they were still in school playing a gig there. But fast forward down to 2003, and of course this album, it's got that big American sound, Dan, hasn't it? And very much inspired by bands like the Beach Boys, and they wear their influences on their sleeve. It has to be said. You don't have to be a musical genius to spot what the musical influences are on this album.
You mentioned the Slattery's takes me back there, because when I was a youngster, like many youngsters, like yourself, indeed, Paul, I played in various bands, and a number of times we played in Slattery's of Capel Street. For young Dublin musicians, playing in Slattery's was really a rite of passage. And one gig that I played stands out in my head. There was other actual cool bands on that. A band called the Hot Sprockets were playing, which they got
Remember
quite
them,
big
yes.
afterwards. But I'll tell you why I remember this gig, right?
Could have been you, Dan.
It could have been me. But I'll tell you why I remember it. The last gig I ever played myself in Slattery's, right, was because it was the night the smoking ban came in. But I remember there was people who didn't even smoking because it was the last time they could ever smoke inside. But the Thrills really did. When I listened back to this album, it brought me straight back to 2003. And like, I say this probably every every episode, but music has a way of bringing you back to a time and a place like nothing else possibly can. And I remember that summer, as you say, it was the sound of the summer. I remember I was working in Spar and behind the till, and the songs from this album were consistently on the radio. And from memory, now correct me if I'm wrong here, Paul. I think 2003 was a pretty decent summer weather-wise.
It was a long hot summer, and the Thrills really were the sound of that summer. That the album was very much, well, they had a complicated relationship with critics because they had been very much hyped up well before even the release of the album. There was, a small number of singles produced for Santa Cruz. You're Not That Far. That was November 2002. And even at that, as soon as that went out as a promo single, the band started to get a lot of positive press coverage. But then there was a backlash. Um, so some critics were a little bit iffy about the Trills, it's fair to say. But they were hyped up. So Santa Cruz arrives in November 2002. Morrissey recommended them. Bono recommended them. I mean, and this was the kind of thing you used to get back then. A recommendation from an existing music star, a piece in one of the, in one of the music papers, that would make you. It's a completely different story. 20 years on, things have changed, and not necessarily for the better. But that was the way they were major. There was a huge bidding war about the band. They were dropped by one record label, but they were eventually picked up by Virgin EMI. And there was big competition to sign them up. So this album explodes. On the back of the first single off it proper was One Horse Town, which is an absolutely beautiful track. It's the fifth track on the album. It's my favorite track on the album. I love it, Dan. I love the positivity of it. Love the tempo of it. Love that the way it starts with the piano. The second single was Big Sore. That comes in June 9th, in 2003. And I can remember that, and I remember the date it came out, because of course I was big into the Trills, and I love them, and I just remembered so well the single coming out, and it's got a great start. Dan, I mean, I don't know. Do you want to try humming it?
No, but the
You know the way it starts, though.
go on, you humming.
No, I'm not going to go. "Whirr." I mean, that's the sound I always make. It's the only sound I can make. But it comes out Big Sore, and then they follow that up. They reissued Santa Cruz, You're Not That Far, and then they had Steal Our Son as well. So I mean, that is a great run of singles. And it kicked off this huge period for the band where they started doing these huge tours, and things got a bit crazy. But what a great band, and all about the summer of 2003, which I would have been 20. And really they mark that sound. They really defined a certain sound. And Dan, one of the interesting things as well, if you cast your memory back to the music scene, they were in a kind of scene. So you had bands like the Strokes, bands like the White Stripes, bands like the Hives, all very very different. But that was a kind of a scene, wasn't it? It was a very much American sound, and there was blues music in there, there was country music. But I think you'd have to say the band which this album pays homage to. Okay, the Birds are in there, but you've got to probably say it's the Beach Boys. Really, Dan, isn't it? I mean, this, you can hear the Beach Boys all over this album.
Yeah, definitely. Like when the band were interviewed by the Guardian, and they were asked about their influences, and they listed bands like the Birds, musicians and songwriters like Burt Bacharach, producers like Phil Spector, as well as the band and Bob Dylan.
Yeah.
Um, but they also said that Pet Sounds, the famous Beach Boys album, which is one of the best albums ever. If we ever do it on this show, I can say without a doubt I'm going to give it 10 out of 10. But they
Yeah.
said that Pet Sounds inspired the band more than any other record. And apparently, Kevin, who's the keyboard player in the band, was obsessed by the Beach Boys since the age of 9. And he has, back right, talking in 2003 to the Guardian, they said that he got Beach Boys, records and paraphernalia for every birthday. And his dad always took him every year to London for the annual Beach Boys convention. So these guys were massive Beach Boys fans. And I think the Beach Boys, back in 2003, 2004, were kind of coming back into
That's right.
mainstream consciousness. Not that they ever, disappeared. They're one of the biggest bands in history, but their popularity seemed to grow again because you had people talking about how great Pet Sounds were. You had news that Brian Wilson, who was the key member of the Beach Boys, was going to release a new version of the unreleased album, which kind of came out in the form of Smiley Smile by the Beach Boys, but Brian Wilson was going to release the album Smile in 2004. And just in 2003, that was announced, and people were talking about the fact he was also going to perform his album Smile live. So there was a lot of excitement around that. And as you say, it was a time when music was looking back to past bands. So, if you look at the Strokes, if you look at the Hives, all the bands you mentioned, they all kind of harp back to bands in the past. And I think the Thrills certainly are one of those bands that wear their influences on their sleeves. For example, if you listen to songs like Deck Chairs and Cigarettes, for instance, the opening piano on that clearly harps back to the Carpenters, um, Close to You. Listen to it, and you'll hear that song coming across in it. Or if you listen to songs like One Horse Town, you can kind of hear the same melody as Build Me Up Buttercup coming through in that as well. So it wasn't that they were plagiarists, or that they were kind of copying someone in a really kind of cheeky, cheesy way, but you could definitely hear their influences. Would you agree, Paul?
Yeah, definitely, Dan. And I mean, it's funny that when you cast your mind back to Pet Sounds, I mean, there's a lot of this album sounds like a lot of different bands and a lot of different acts, and their influences are worn on their sleeve. You got Bob Dylan, you got the band in there, you got Birds, but you certainly have the Beach Boys and Pet Sounds. And Pet Sounds was 25 years old in 2001, in the summer of 2001. And I remember it well. I mean, I got a copy of it myself, and I loved it. Still have the same copy. Still give it a wear every now and then. And one of the things about that album is it's, on the one hand, it can be very happy and positive and upbeat, and then on the other hand, it can have this deep melancholy. And in fairness to the Trills, they managed to do that on this album. I mean, you've got songs like One Horse Town, which is kind of pure escapism. You've got Big Sur, which again is just, there's a great positivity running through it. And then you get a song like Deck Chairs and Cigarettes, which is slower and, which is wistful. And they do that a number of times on the album. And I think they do it very, very successfully. And I mean, I think the thing about this album that has to be mentioned is its incredibly positive outlook. I mean, they were in their early 20s at the time. They looked fantastic, it has to be said. And they were kitted out, they were styled up to the nines. They had a look, they had an image, they had a defined sound. And you felt in 2003 that this was a band with the world at their feet. And when you look at the Glastonbury footage on YouTube, you'll just see it. A sea of people, and they obviously would have been one of the biggest bands that summer to play to play the Glastonbury gig in 2003. And they had the world at their feet. And it's fair to say that they've never broken up properly. They do different things. They're still out there. And who knows, Dan, we may see them back again. And I'm very happy to issue that call on this podcast tonight and use the good offices of the Big Album Show to say would very much look forward to seeing an anniversary gig 18 years on. It'd be great. Come on, guys, get back together.
It's fair to
It'd be
say we'd be
fantastic.
thrilled, but
It would be fair to say we should. And wouldn't it be a good thing? I mean, as we move, in 18 years on, to reform the band. I'm going to give a few hot takes here on the tracks on the album. My standout track, Dan, is the biggest single. I think it was the most requested song on BBC Radio 1 that year. That's One Horse Town. That was their biggest hit. I'm going to go with that as my favorite song, my top tune. What about you, Dan? What would you go for as your top tune? Do you have a top tune?
Okay, I'll give you my third favorite first, right? Because I'm gonna do it in order for a particular reason. So my third top tune is Santa Cruz. You're not that far, right? I really think it was a strong song to start the album with. It starts slowly, um, and then the chorus kind of speeds up. So there's a good kind of dynamic element to the song. You have the banjo throughout the song, as you do
Yeah.
in various other songs, like Big Sur, like One Horse Town. You have the piano, you have the kind of Beach Boy esque backing vocals, maybe not as elaborate as Pet Sounds, but definitely influenced by Pet Sounds. And I think it's a feel good song. It's as you say, it's escapism, and it sounds like the summer. So the minute I hear that song, the minute you put on the album, it takes you back to the summers of youth.
Yeah, agree, Dan. And I mean, the keyboard track on it is fantastic. And I have to be said, I mean, the drums in it are really, really good as well. You know that there's a great pause, and the drums come in, and again, only a band like the Trills, can they have a very definite sound, don't they? And as soon as you hear that song, you know it's the Trills. And fair play to them. That still is a really, really fresh song today. That's Big Sur. What would be your number two, Dan?
Right, number two would be track number two on the album. So you can see where this is going, which is Big Sur. So it's incredibly similar to Santa Cruz. You have the same kind of sound. You have the banjo again, all of that kind of thing. It's very very close in terms of its overall kind of feel to Santa Cruz. You're not that far, and again, it was a very popular song for the Thrills.
And what about your number one?
Number one. So my number one is track number
Is
three on the album, which is "Don't Steal Our Son."
Yeah.
I thought some of it sounds a bit like Elliott Smith. The kind of the chorus, the melody reminded me a little bit of that. I think it's nice where you have those kind of staccato kind of verses. Again, one thing's for sure is that the Thrills understand music, and they definitely know how to put a song together. And I think the influence of the great songwriters they listen to, like Burt Bacharach, definitely comes across in their music because they understand how to put a song together. Um, and for me, the album starts very, very strongly. Um, but and then I think you have One Horse Town, as you say. Then you have Deck Chairs. Well, Deck Chairs and Cigarettes comes first. Then One Horse Town, and then I'm sad to say, for me, it doesn't go downhill, but it kind of peters off after that. That's my view. Controversial hot take there.
Yeah, I mean, look, I mean, for me, my top three would go One Horse Town. I go Don't Steal Our Son, and I go Big Sur as number three. I think Don't Steal Our Son is a really strong track. I
Hmm.
love that line. The bottom fell out of all our summers, and there's a self awareness in these songs because there's a cleverness and there's almost a nod to the sort of the story of the Trills. On the one hand, this is a happy story, it's a happy album, it's a positive album, but they never quite lived up to their promise. And you kind of almost get that. And this is an album for me about the summer, and it's kind of a summer which never quite lives up to its promise. Don't entirely agree with you on the second half of the album. I think there's some really strong tracks in there. And a track like "Say It Ain't So," I think it's the eighth or ninth track on the album. And would you believe George W. Bush loved that song and had it on a list of tunes that he used to play. Don't let that cloud your judgment. Really, really strong song.
And you can see, I think you can kind of see why George Bush would like that song, because it's country music, and that song "Say It Ain't So" and the second the song after that, "Hollywood Kids," they both have really strong elements of country music, like a slide guitar,
Yeah.
a kind of a twangy guitar sound in it, that makes it sound like something that you'd imagine George Bush listening to, you know.
Yeah, you know, it has an appeal. They don't sound in any way Irish, if you know what I mean. I mean, there's nothing sort of Irish about this. Not that there has to be anything Irish about it, but they sound, you know, they wear their influences on their sleeve, and they delivered a really really strong album. The follow ups to that, I think I mentioned in the beginning, they followed up. Which in 2004 they followed it up with Let's Bottle Bohemia, which had a huge single, What Happened to Corey Haim, on it. And then they finished the thing up with, well, not to finish the thing, their last album was Teenager, which was released in 2007. Very strong track on that, Nothing Changes Around Here. Some people may be familiar with that. That album was not a rip-roaring success, and the Thrills were dropped by their label. Um, there is a greatest hits floating around somewhere, 2002, 2007. I don't think it was ever properly issued or given a proper launch, but there is a greatest hits. And let's just hope that we haven't seen the last of the Thrills. And can I give my final take on the album, which is well worth a listen, very enjoyable, very positive, very fun, and it'll get you up and bopping around the place. It'll get you doing your air guitar, your air drums, your air bass, your air singing, whatever you're having yourself. Great band, looked absolutely smashing, brilliant production, brilliant presentation, and it gets a very, very positive 7.5 out of 10 from me. How about you, Dan?
Okay, I like from reading about the Trails and and their backstory and so on. It seems to me that anyone who's ever come across the guys personally says they're great guys. Like there was one person, a guy called Dara, who left a message on our Facebook page, and he said that he bumped into the Trails one night, and they were incredibly nice. So
Yeah,
sound like a top group of lads, and I think that's
absolutely.
important to say. Um, and I do think it is a strong album. I think that it has some very very good tracks. As I say, it starts wonderfully. It doesn't end badly, but it doesn't. I don't feel like the album builds towards something. I think it kind of, as I say, peters out. And that's not to say the songs at the end of the album are bad or anything like that. But I think because they started so strongly, it's very hard to continue in that vein right through the album. So maybe perhaps it's not a criticism. Perhaps it's just saying that the songs at the start of the album are incredibly powerful. Um, but I would have to say, although it's a fantastic album, I wouldn't rate it up there with some of the classic albums that we've discussed. I think it's a very strong album, and I think it's a very good album of summer, but I will give it a 6. Rather,
Harsh, Dan.
no, I don't think so. I think
Harsh.
I would look at 6 as pretty good. Because you have to remember that on the big album show, we're looking at big albums. All of the albums we discuss are albums that we think have some merit, and you know yourself, Paul. We don't put a great deal of thought into the albums we pick. We really just pick albums that we enjoy and that our friends enjoy, and that. Um, so the fact that they get on our show like shows the respect I have for the album. So I don't mean to diss it, but I just think compared to the
I
other
know. I
albums,
don't.
I
I
don't want
don't
to
think you
compare
did
it.
that. Just. I don't.
Hmm?
I don't think you did that intentionally, just to diss it, as Eminem would say.
No, no, definitely not. And I would recommend if you haven't heard this album, go back and listen to
Check
it.
it
You
out.
know, they were so
Absolutely.
big. They were on like they were on the OC
The
5
OC. That's right.
times. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Top of the pops.
And yeah, top of the pops, the whole shebang.
The whole
And
thing.
I do hope that this album is remembered long into the future.
Absolutely. And for me, my abiding memory of the Trills will always be seeing them in Witness in summer 2003. And I'll never forget the excitement. It was in one of the tents. It was the tent with absolutely jammers. You couldn't get in. They were the coolest thing. They were they were absolutely present in the moment at a great gig and show that was. So thanks very much to everyone, as always, for listening to Big Album Show. Please remember to like us, subscribe, share our podcast. If you like it, please bring along another listener. Thanks to everyone for your support, and thanks to the people who left comments on our pages and got in touch with us with your takes for this show about So Much for the City of Thrills, which has reached its 18th birthday.
The next album we're going to look at on the Big Album Show is Blue by Joni Mitchell. It truly is a classic album, so listen to it, let us know your hot takes, let us know what kind of feelings the album provokes in you, and do tune in to our next episode. Thanks a million. Bye-bye.
Thank you, and talk to you soon.
You're listening to the Big Album Show with Paul Dillon and Dan O'Neill.